So I've noticed in our blogging and stuff that we've been focusing a lot on languages being lost, and whether that's important or how it's lost and how it's preserved. I know that you had a concern you had a concern you wanted to raise with.
Yeah, I've been noticing just like how different languages are either dead or have been preserved. Like Latin has carried on its roots till today. That you see in so many medical terminology and just pretty much just so many facets of our language today. And I have Middle Egypt, the Middle Kingdom, and it's just interesting to see how Middle Kingdom's hieroglyphics is a dead language, and why didn't that carry on till today? Just in comparison.
You talk about Latin as being preserved, but I mean, what constitutes a language actually being preserved? For instance, I had the Sumerian language, like from Mesopotamia, and there still exist, words that derive from that language, and the guy I interviewed told me that there are about 24 people that can actually read and understand Sumerian. But is that preserved, or?
Once they die, it's gone.
Well, even if there were always those 20 or so people that knew the language, is that really preserved, or is that just?
It's preserved through probably other scholars that speak it.
Yeah.
It's not within the actual culture.
Exactly. And that brings back something that when I interviewed him, he said. I asked him about language, and he said that languages are have to be in context of that culture, and I feel like that's an important point that sometimes gets lost, is that the context of the culture is almost half the battle.
So even if the language is still alive, if the culture that used it is dead, it's a pointless language. Or a dead pointless. The culture is dead.
But it loses half its meaning, I feel like.
Okay.
But that's what kind of my concern is, that Latin today, culturally we all use it, and not even just in English, but in so many other languages we still use it. So culturally, it's still prevalent.
And you were wondering what made Latin do that as compared to other,
like ancient Egyptian. Why
did it get preserved?
Yeah, what's the difference?
Well, I think one of the reasons was that during the Renaissance in Western Europe, a lot of different countries that didn't really speak Greek or Latin went back to look at Rome and Greece and restudied the languages and tried to revive them as they were imitating classicism. And that was one of the reasons that, even after 1,000 years after the Roman Empire fell, the language kind of resurfaced because people made a conscious effort to go back and try to get it back.
So that ties into acquisition a little bit, where, okay, so we have this language, it's been written down, nobody's speaking it really. We have ancient Egyptian. How would you go learn it?
Well, which brings into why Latin is being preserved, whereas ancient Egyptian hasn't. And it says, because we in the West have valued the contributions of the ancient Greeks and Hebrews as fundamental to our very being, we have lovingly preserved whatever was written in either language.
So
yeah, it's all to do with what we have chosen to care about. I know that as far as
so an example.
So that's like why we learn the languages of.
An example then of culture valuing societies, the Scythians that I've been studying, their language isn't really still the way it was, but most of Iranian cultures have strong ties to the Scythians. They still have parts of their language, they still have aspects of their languages and stories and myths and things like that have been preserved, and they've acquired them because they were part of the society that the Scythians evolved to or progressed to. So there's a strong tie to the past, for sure, of what have people valued, what has society or a society preserved because it was important. What have we preserved? We preserved Latin and Greek because we like the concept of bells going off in our ears. No, we've preserved what we've liked. The Iranians preserved some of the Scythians. The question then is, what's still around? What can we find? Where will we find it?
And I want to talk a little bit about something that kind of was a little controversial. I know that a quote that I had on my blog, and then I want to hear, like, you have some really interesting stuff about the Mayans, I feel like. But one thing that I found a quote that said essentially that the Sumerians had invented their own speaking system. And I know that that caused some concern. This is what he said. He said that taught themselves how to speak is a pretty strong claim. It's probably too extensive a claim. However, most people agree that they invented writing as a dramatic revolution in communication. But as far as speaking, I can't agree with that. So that hopefully that resolves a little bit of that ambiguity. And what was the main thing you focused on with your Mayan posting?
I was focusing on Babal and how it came to exist and how, in writing it, they used the mnemonic device of parallelism and how they wrote it as they would speak it in order to preserve it.
Nice.
And that was fascinating.
I found the same thing with Egyptians, is that they spoke in prose, which is more of like a presenting type. You know, they were very into, I wouldn't say theater, but they definitely had those who would just... So, the Egyptians definitely were into the presentation, and so because they would speak that way, they wrote that way in two-line prose. So I thought it was...
Another thing that's similar to how in Quiboga they wrote how they spoke is in the classical epics, and specifically the Aeneid, because that's what I talked about with Rome. They have these parts where there are characters that give like grand, eloquent speeches where they just like get up there and they just talk and talk, and that's still something that's written because it's in the Aeneid, but it's still another example of a strong preservation in oral tradition into their texts that were preserved and then later studied.
So, yeah, we can kind of, it's difficult to find an oral tradition that survives merely as an oral tradition, but so we try and find these things through what we know that's written down. Is that?
So language is preserved by writing down what's said?
Making a conscious effort to do it. Because you can't just think that's preserved forever.
Amen.